It is with great pleasure that I'm allowing myself to introduce Sofía Oloscoaga's lecture Symposium, here also explained in its etymology, drinking together. Is that the right way to say it, Sofía? Would you have explained it in other terms?
No, drinking together is fine.
Okay. So Sofía Oloscoaga's practice is focused in the intersections of art and education through the exploration of encounters, think tanks, and public programs, along with artists, theorists, curators, and educators, and with a wide range of institutional and independent interlocutors. Oloscoaga was co-curator of the 32nd Biennial Sao Paulo Biennial, academic curator at MUAC, in Mexico City, 2014 to 2015, research curatorial fellow at Independent Curators International in 2011, and Helena Rubinstein, curatorial fellow at the Whitney Museum of American Arts Independent Study Program in 2010. She received her BFA with honors from La Esmeralda National School of Fine Arts. In 2012, she was workshop clinics director at International Symposium of Contemporary Art Theory, and from 2007 to 2010, head of education and public programs at Museo de Arte Carrillo Gil, both in Mexico City. Sofía has collaborated with another roadmap for arts education, Red de Conceptualismos del Sur, Food Art Research Networks, and Arts Collaboratorium. Her long-term research project, Between Utopia and Disenchantment, focuses on the collective memory of and genealogies stemming from international communities, models developed in Mexico in past decades, addressing the ideas posed by Ivan Illich at the Centro Intercultural de Documentación, and its influential role in the practice of many Mexican and international thinkers in various self-organized initiatives. Recently, she was awarded membership of Sistema Nacional de Creadores Artísticos in Mexico as grantee in experimental practices 2019 to 2022 to develop the ongoing project, The Nurturer, Cooking to Learn. Welcome, Sofía. Thank you so much for being here with us today.
Hi, everyone. I'm kind of seeing some familiar faces around. I'm really sorry that I cannot be in person there with you. I've been following online these very, very rich 2 days, as much as I've been able to. It's due to health reasons that I wasn't able to join you, but I think we're gonna start with a toast. There were beers offered, is that right? Yeah, did everyone who wishes to get their beer? Yeah, I see Nico raising their beer. So I wanted to start with a toast just as a reminder of a notion of symposium. And symposium is originally or etymologically, let's say. Wait, I'm trying to share my screen. Okay. It's sim together and posium or posima, which would be drinking together. And it was a reminder of the spirit of symposium as that extraordinary gathering that allows us to inebriate from each other's ideas, and a kind of situation of collective engagement where we can reach a kind of imagination and a realization that is really hard that we get to on our own. So this has been 2 days where you've been listening to each other, and I wanted just to kind of like invocate this original or ancestral notion of the symposium as that kind of capacity to think together and to come collectively to a state of realization that it's only possible when we actually open up and reach this altered state of mind amongst each other. So I probably imagine that by now it also entails exhaustion and what is also part of altered states of mind. And just to celebrate these 2 days and to also kind of like call in that spirit, which is less about, let's say, professionalized performances of presentation and more about coming together. And like I said, I'm really sorry I wasn't able to be there in presence, but I'm hoping that we can close probably with this spirit. This is something that Illich recalled. This is something that Illich recalled in one of his latest published books, which wasn't authored by him, but it was published after his death in 2005, and it's called The Rivers North of the Future, and it's a series of conversations by David Cayley, which took place over the course of a couple of years, and then he published a series of reflections after Illich's death, based on his different stages of production, of critical production. And he kind of recalls these the presence of professionalized performativity that we have embedded and introjected so profoundly that sometimes, even though there are so many resources dedicated and devoted to the sort of gatherings as symposia where we come together to present each other's ideas, there's so many material resources, the time, just the bodily presence, the listening, the energy that's put together, all the economic resources for this to happen. And there is a question about how deep, how effective are these gatherings in terms of the desire and the urgency that we have to meet and to connect to each other, and how much we sometimes become or remain coded within the frames of performativity of our specialized professions and specialized studies in such a way that we kind of lose this organicity of being truly, like I said, inebriated from each other's ideas. So it was just a call to keep in mind, which I'm going to come in later. I wanted to share with you a bit of the research that some of you have already perhaps learned about, but I'm going to try to go through it as agilely, as rapidly as I can. And it's a research that the way I approach Illich's ideas started as a personal research. I grew up in a city called Cuernavaca, where Illich founded CIDOC between the 60s and the 70s. But it was also a place where my family created with other families an intentional community, a commune, one would say, but not the 60s communes. It was in the early 80s. And as I was an art student and an artist and very much obsessed, I would say, or insisting with collective forms of practice rather than the stereotype of the individual, usually a male artist who produces a singly authored body of work. I was seeking for other references of collectivity within contemporary art in Mexico and recent art history in Mexico, but also in other forms of organizing life in collective ways. And then I realized that I knew little from my early childhood, from this upbringing in a commune where consensus, 100% shared economy, a shared parenthood, among other things, happened over the course of 5.5 years. And I wanted to interrogate this personal history from this perspective of between utopian disenchantment. This is between this idealizing of a utopian project of organizing life differently, and also with that other extreme of failure or disenchantment as a way of dismissing a whole project because of its dissolution. And my question was, between utopian disenchantment, what would be the learning that we might be able to harvest or to reclaim from other generations? So I basically visited the space where La Comunidad happened in Cuernavaca. I kind of looked at what were the very eclectic references and influences for that family project with other families. And I also became aware of a very, very large and longer history of Cuernavaca as a site where so many, between the 50s and the 80s mostly, so many different initiatives took place. Cuernavaca is very close to Mexico City. It's about a 60 miles south. But it has also a very different environment, a kind of garden. It's been called the City of Eternal Spring. It's not that anymore, but it used to be. And it was also a place where since pre-colonial times, but also in different moments in history, it kind of been the place to project different social configurations, one would say, or social living experiments. And between the 50s and the 80s in particular, it was a time where Illich arrived, and there were different, it was a gathering point for different initiatives around alternatives in education, the relationship with social movements, worker movements, land ownership, and workers' rights movements, and also a place where one of the first feminist study centers was originated within that context, and also very important movements around collective, self-organized mental health initiatives. And as you've been hearing about these days, Ivan Illich actually arrived there after leaving Europe and being established in the north of New York for a couple of years, where he met the Puerto Rican community. He was a vice parish there in Washington Heights. And in this encounter with the Puerto Rican community, decided to engage further into this, what he called an intercultural encounter. It was his first time outside of Europe. It was not only the United States, but the colony of Puerto Rico and its communities within the city of New York in the north part of Manhattan. And these intercultural encounter, as he called it, drove him to study and kind of like learn further about the history of colonization in Latin America, but more importantly about the role of the Catholic Church and also its continuation as a cultural model through other Western institutions and their impositions in Latin America. So for a number of years, for 5 years, Illich was in Puerto Rico as the vice rector of the Catholic University of Ponce, and then as part of the education board of the island of Puerto Rico, where there was a gathering of intellectuals trying to design an educational plan for the island of Puerto Rico. And one of the first reminders in this process of a national education plan was from a colleague at the time, Everett Reimer, who was questioning not exactly how much budget and how many schools to be built throughout the Puerto Rican territory, but more importantly, to question really the root of the existing of the school, and to interrogate whether the need in the context of Puerto Rico for a better education really meant building more schools and having a larger budget. And how was that originally reproducing an imposition of an educational model, which was also a cultural imposition that had nothing to do with the original cultural context of the island of Puerto Rico and their inhabitants there. So this was one of the first kind of needs to interrogate the existence of school itself, but mostly to research historically, to do almost an archaeology of the origins of school as an institution. So Illich created there at Ponce one of the first iterations of CIDOC, which was called CIF, and he devoted some time and resources to try to gather a number of documents which were mostly collected through the archives of Catholic churches in Latin America, and to commit to a deep research on these imposition of institutions and the origins of these institutions in the context of Latin America. The breakdown of schools is one of Illich's first drafts. It precedes Deschooling Society, and it was published in CIDOC, which opened finally in Cuernavaca in 1956. And CIDOC became the Center for Intercultural Documentation, which was a space or a center that on the one hand gathered the documents that I was telling you that would allow a group of people, intellectuals, activists from the time, to come together and think through this effect and the impact of Western institutions in Latin America, but also to critically interrogate whether in the discourse and the orientation of the modern social project, more resources development was really the way to carry the cultural imposition that meant immediately the erasure of other forms of organizing communal life and collective sustainability that somehow survived the colonizing project, and that were, to the eyes of Illich, a big question of how to learn to look back at these forms of organizing life rather than continue the modern project and its imposition. CIDOC was actually directed by Valentina Borremans, which is the woman we see on the right of the picture. At least it's my right. I don't know how it's projected there. We see Illich and Valentina in this picture in the offices of CIDOC. Valentina was, like in many cases, the woman who ran CIDOC as a center, who took care of the archive, who created the archiving system of CIDOC's documents and its library, and also who ran administratively most of the work of CIDOC, where Illich gathered a number of people over the years to take part in these critical projects and interrogations. There was also a huge amount of communities that were in a way informing the different critical inquiries that took place at CIDOC. And I'm showing these two images at the beginning because we carry very easily with the tendency of historic accounts that visibilize or visualize single characters and their endeavors as if they weren't held and supported and sometimes carried out by larger communities, in this case, mostly indigenous communities, but also local inhabitants, as well as different women who took part in these processes. In this image, we see the most prominent figures of the time, which would be Paulo Freire on the right, Illich at the center, and one of Peruvian's intellectual, Salazar Bondi, a very complex and controversial person. And CIDOC became this kind of gathering space, and it was also a kind of space without an academic plan in itself. It wanted to it meant to run as a place that would welcome people's inquiries and would also convocate or implicate other people in following some of the other critical inquiries. At the time, they had a home offset press, which produced CIDOC's publications. These were separated by different kinds of publications, dossiers and essays, but they were also a way of distributing not necessarily finished books or statements, but some of the ongoing drafts of the discussions that were taking place at the time. Between 61 and 67, there were particular seminars that were along 4 or 6 weeks long that took place in the summers that were particularly focused in the alternatives in education. So this Schooling Society has been referenced, and also the notion of the learning web or the educational web, as the title of the exhibition and the symposium recall. And at the time, these alternatives in education were the way of gathering different activists, educators coming from Latin America, but also from North America, Canada, and from the United States, Canada, and some parts in Europe mostly, trying to rethink the alternatives to that educational model that the Schooling Society later, a few years later in '76, was trying to question from the roots. If you recall the opening or the introduction of the Schooling Society mentions a number of people who, like Paul Goodman, Paulo Freire, Everett Reimer, Maxine Green, and a number of people who had been part of these seminars of alternative in education, and that in a way nourished and created part of the critical statement that Illich is wanting to share through that book. So I really want to recall this collective process and dialogue that's behind these ideas, and also to kind of situate or contextualize a practice of itself of the learning webs or the educational web through CIDOC. So to me, it has been really important to approach CIDOC and Illich's ideas not only through their theoretical approach, but mostly in trying to look at how they carried out in real life in terms of a practice. So not only looking at them as statements that were created from an academic context, which they weren't, but engaged in a specific social context in Latin America, but also within a practice of itself, which was a kind of rehearsal of the educational web through CIDOC. Cuernavaca was at the time a moment where a number of other things were happening. This is Gregorio Lemercier, who was running a Benedictine monastery that engaged in group psychoanalysis, but also in an aesthetic transformation of the ritual of the Catholic gathering itself through work. This is Frida Smuth, one of the leaders of the group psychoanalysis process that took place in the Benedictine monastery, which created, of course, a number of scandals, and then required the community of the Monasterio Benedictino de Santa Maria Aguacatitlan to leave the monastery itself, close the door, and go across the street to create a new space called Emmaus, which means rejected people. A number of things were happening at the time, which involved a kind of renewal of the ritual of gathering itself through these aesthetic interventions that entailed everything from the garments to the music and the rituals to the aesthetics of the spaces themselves. This is some of the priests' garments that were designed by Fray Gabriel Chavez de la Mora, who was an architect and also a member of the Benedictine community. Méndez Arceo was a Catholic bishop who was very early committed with a kind of like leftist movement within the Catholic Church that adhered to what was called the Second Vatican Council that was signed in Medellin in Colombia in '67, and which committed to develop a social project of the Catholic Church by recognizing structures of power that the church itself was reproducing at the time, and to what was called la opción por los pobres, to kind of explicitly adhere and reorient the social project of the church and a political project as a way of accompanying the conditions of misery and poverty, but also of the reorganization and political organization of the oppressed, one would say, in Latin America. These took many different directions. It became, in some places in Colombia, with the priest, for example, Camilo Torres, an armed movement. Also in El Salvador and Nicaragua, it's been the kind of a networked engine of very important uprising and movements in Latin America, and what at the time some of the members of this leftist political project within the church took part in. And Méndez Arceo in Cuernavaca was one of the let's say most visible faces at the time, very strongly related to Salvador Allende in Chile. The bells of Cuernavaca were sounded when in '73 the coup in Chile was realized, but also with the student movement in Mexico in '68 and the huge massacre that happened on October 2nd. And these also involved non-Catholic artists such as Matthias Geritz, for example, and other cultural practitioners to kind of like redesign a kind of language that would allow for the social space of these churches to become also the places for political organization and intellectual realization. Paulo Freire was very close to this. Pedagogy of the Oppressed was one of the main engines of what became the movement of El Movimiento de Comunidades Eclesiales de Base, or what is also learned as the popular education movement. And this has very, very strong ties through the 70s, 80s, and 90s with very important social movements in the region of Latin America. This was, for example, a mass that was celebrated at the cathedral in Cuernavaca, where the Western Gregorian chants were changed or transformed into mariachi and pre-Hispanic instruments for the masses. And there was this kind of like renewal of the aesthetics. This is Betsy Hollands, who opened CIDAL. Betsy Hollands was a journalist, a Belgian journalist that originally arrived in CIDOC and encountered such a male environment that decided to open a kind of like sister center called CIDAL, which was focusing on the situation of and rights of women in Latin America. CIDAL opened a few years around CIDOC, after CIDOC, and it still exists as one of the references of one of the first feminist studies centers in the region. So Between Utopia and Disenchantment became less of a project around my family and more of an intention to learn about what had happened in Cuernavaca in these earlier years, and with the fascination of tracing what we called an affective genealogy. And this was a number of people, initiatives, and movements that permeated through generations, not necessarily as part of one group's history, but where the initiatives and their drives in a way could be traced throughout different influences around, like I said, social movements, alternatives in education, and also critical and cultural practitioners, where Cuernavaca became a gathering point, but that were related to many other movements happening at the time. This is, again, the decades where some of the more important revolutionary movements and then the counter totalitarian regimes were established through the dictatorships in Argentina, Uruguay, Brazil, Chile, Peru, and more countries at the time. And somehow there was this effervescence, like I said, between the 60s and the 70s. So I invited, very much thinking of Illich's educational web. I really want to say that the translation to Spanish of the educational web is actually learning threads, or tramas del aprendizaje. And there's a part of that 6th chapter of Deschooling Society where Illich kind of refrains from using the word network, saying that it could be read as a model that can be replicated and instrumentalized, and that tries to then position or prefer the notion of a threading or a weaving that kind of like entails a practice in itself, and it's not only a model to be reproduced. And so tramas del aprendizaje, or learning threads, was a kind of reference that we used. I invited a group of people. This is Sol Enaro, a Mexican curator and historian, Mauricio Martín, also a curator of archives and kind of like non-objectual practices in arts. Maru Calva, a designer that's followed male art and a lot of, again, non-object-based practices, and Naomi Rincon Gallardo, who's an artist and educator. And with this group, we kind of put together what Illich calls in these learning threads, peers of learning. So who are friends that can accompany or share this desire and urgency to learn together. And so because of their own artistic and curatorial interest, but also because of their own personal lives, I thought that this needed to be a really collectivized project. And so we started using the notion of learning threads as our own collective learning model or methodology, one would say. So it entails 4 parts, which is, the first is to find peers who would want to learn the same you want to learn. Also, people who have an accumulated experience, who might be able to share it from their own experience, what Illich calls references, the access to educational tools that could be books. In this case, we put together an ongoing or a process-based archive that was a mobile archive in these blue boxes you see here, which was where we were trying to compile everything from publications that were around, archives that we found literally in boxes in some people's offices in Cuernavaca, and trying to put together what we see here in what you see here in the wall is a kind of timeline where we're trying to understand and trace who'd been at CIDOC when, and what were the things or reference that we could find that were published at the time. The gatherings were also organized for a year and a half, initially or ideally in non-institutional spaces and in more kind of like immersive situations where we traveled with our documentation center with these books, photocopies, and a mobile Xerox machine that we used to circulate and to copy these documents. These were thought of as study sessions. We also organized a collective timeline mapping and discussions, and gathered with people who had, we ended up being a group of around 43 people from generations from 23 to 81, people who were artists, activists, educators, and in very Illichian terms, deprofessionalized practitioners. With the idea of learning from those who had a direct experience within CIDOC and the other initiatives that we were trying to learn from, and to try less, we were not interested in tracing or writing the history of CIDOC and Cuernavaca, but to learn from people's accounts of what was learned through these years. And this intergenerational component of the group was also a way of engaging with our current questions around other ways of organizing life, economies, education, and the possibilities of learning together also from embodied practices and through our own affective memories. So this was, for example, a singing booklet where we put together, we asked people in the group to share the songs that they felt that reminded them of these utopian imaginaries from their different times and locations, and then put together singing sessions where we kind of like join each other in our own very, very different imaginaries and engaged and tapped into this affective memory that it's so strongly related to music as well, and to other forms of language. These were a number of sessions that we carried out in Beta Local in Puerto Rico, which is an artist-run space that runs through a collective directorship, and that was also carrying an online-based, but also physical educational program that was structured through the Learning Webs project that is called actually La Iván Illich, with this idea that it's also part of the learning threads methodology, where everyone who wants to learn and everyone who has something to teach should be able to come together. And Beta Local proposed itself as a space to create this exchange of abilities and experiences and tools as a managing of exchanges, where we did different reading sessions and also tapped into these very different people who had been part of CIDOC or had met Illich through Puerto Rico. There was a very strong connection between Puerto Rico and Cuernavaca, particularly San Juan and Ponce in Puerto Rico. And there were a lot of people around with an untapped experience and histories of having been exchange students in high schools and university courses that maintained a very strong relationship with Illich after he left Puerto Rico and opened CIDOC in Cuernavaca, and that would come to spend summers or different terms of their formation years in Cuernavaca. And so there was a very strong connection there, and we did this number of gatherings to try to create a register of collective memory of these different affective genealogies. Like I was saying, we were also reading some of Illich's texts, like Tools of Conviviality in this session in particular, and trying to reflect on the very interesting and very important self-organized and collective projects that were already being carried throughout, in this case, the island of Puerto Rico, that had a kind of named, let's say, relationship with these self-organization tools. So after a year and a half of gatherings, we decided to create a kind of public gesture that would somehow communicate the different projects that we had learned. Actually, if we had learned something, then how to communicate this in a public gesture in the city of Cuernavaca at the time of the ending of our collective study or collective learning process. So we put together a kind of mini festival. It was a 4-day festival with many different forms of practices, from community radios to performances, with collaborations that emerged through these sessions in very organic affinities. And this happened in Jardín Borda, which is an open space. It's a public park that has also some exhibition rooms. It's not exactly a contemporary art center, but a number of exhibitions happen there, along with very wide and diverse public programming, and that it's kind of part of the collective memory of Cuernavaca's inhabitants and visitors. And it's very close to the sites where some of the histories that I've mentioned took place, like the cathedral and SIDOC's initial venues. And we spatialized our timeline. We put together in a very open and accessible way all of our learning materials, and integrated in this timeline the artistic interventions of the collaborators that participated throughout the project. We held a number of public sessions at the time with different interlocutors, and it was a way of opening up our learning rather than telling the history of SIDOC through an exhibition, and also to create a more balanced dialogue between the artistic interventions and the other practices. This was a public press that created a number of workshops around visual poetry and its legacy in Latin America, with political slogans that in a way also needed to be rewritten, and with the proposal of Magali Lara and Nuria Montiel, the artists of this project, in a more poetic and in a visual poetry kind of way, and inviting to create different forms of communicating politically also within the social movements of Cuernavaca at the time. Different sessions, including embodied practices coming from the communal, from the self-organized health practices, mental health practices, sorry, and some sort of live performances. And this space was open for about 4 months, inviting people to propose different activities, and also to integrate new documents and elements to our spatialized timeline. There were people who found themselves in pictures and then came back with their families. There was a former secretary of SIDOC that came back with her former colleagues and brought more pictures. And we had a kind of like open schedule for activities to be proposed. A number of political events happened at the time in Cuernavaca that were also disrupting, but also kind of like reinforcing the need for this collective memory to be put together. I won't be able, for a matter of time, to talk about all the interventions that happened at the time and the different performances that took place. This was a weaving basket and reading out loud session carried out by Beta Local, and where at the time Oscar Gonzalez, who now runs the Escuela de Oficios, was also participating, and it was basically morning warm-up sessions where we try to learn basket weaving, which is something that the Beta Local practitioners from Puerto Rico learn themselves, and then kind of like challenge themselves to be able to teach us in their visit in Cuernavaca, and where different texts from our archive and documentation center were being read at the time as we were weaving. This is a practice that was inspired by the old tobacco factories in Cuba. This is a performance by Naomi Rincon Gallardo, which was a very rich body of work that I would love to share the link, as I wasn't able, because of time, to share today, that it's called Odisea Ocotepec, and it's a number of video clips. This is songs that were inspired, on the one hand, in some of Illich's crucial or most important notions and ideas of deinstitutionalizing imagination, of the limits to growth, and of some of Freire's ideas around banking education and the pedagogy of the oppressed and liberation pedagogy. And these were transformed into songs and lyrics that were accompanied by a live performance, but also by a visual language that was recalling, on the one hand, this idealization of the rural and of these original communities in Latin America, along with a kind of failed modernity created with third stage materials, what we call the fourth region, of a kind of failed notion of science that nevertheless reclaims these discourses of modernity. This was performed with a school band that wrote their own version of what a deschooling learning would look like, what a school of the future should be like in their own terms. A pirate radio that had its own public program a few blocks away from our venue, with the participants of the exhibition and the project, but talking out loud in a book fair that was happening just a couple of blocks away from the city, and this from the site, of the exhibition. And this is another collective who put together a universal donated dance step bank that became a public dancing night at the park. And after these 4 months, we called for a kind of like public meeting to decide with those who were interested or appealed what to do with the archive, but more importantly, how to keep it alive. At the time, many of the activists and intellectuals who had been continuing Illich's projects and ideas, but also questioning them, such as Gustavo Esteva, who's here in the picture, right at the center, who passed away last year, and also Javier Sicilia, who was the leader of the Movimiento para la Paz con Justicia y Dignidad, a really kind of like responding to the critical violence of Cuernavaca in 2014 when this session happened. This is Aeromoto, a public library that was created by some of the members of the project, and who still runs in Mexico City as a public art library. And this is where the archive arrived or landed and continues to be open for public access and also for activation. Unitierra in Oaxaca was one of the spaces of the learning communities that was founded in a way with the spirit of CIDOC, but also questioning the fact that in most of CIDOC's gatherings, there was a commitment to talk about the notions of injustice and the implications of the cultural imposition of Western institutions in Latin America, but very rarely were those people who were oppressed and less favored present in these discussions. And so Unitierra in Oaxaca and also Unitierra in Chiapas, which is the Zapatista University, were in a way a kind of response that continues the legacy of CIDOC among many other influences, but also responds with a deschooled learning process that starts with the communities to create the kind of learning needs and exchanges that are important for the self-organization and autonomy for the communities themselves. So I'm gonna just finish with again, this notion of symposium, what I'd originally proposed, being there present when the plan of being there present was in Hamburg, was still on, was to get together today, not only to drink and toast, but also to prepare together a kind of, at least a drink or a meal that would allow us to gather by doing and making together. This was referred to also in Annette Krause's and Emily's session. The project I've been working on recently, it's called The Nurturer, or Cooking to Learn. It's a project in progress where I kind of responded to this need where Illich is kind of talking with David Cayley, as I told you before. He kind of reflects upon, he became an itinerant scholar after closing CIDOC in 76. CIDOC closed because Illich was interrogated along with other people that were part of CIDOC by the Vatican to give a notion or to inform about the names of 80 people who were activists and militants of different social movements of Latin America at the time, and Illich denied and refused to do that. And by that also refused to any ties with the institution at the time. And there was a collective discussion to close CIDOC in 76, also because it was becoming the kind of institution that it was trying to, or it kind of like anticipated the risk of creating an institutionalized practice that was originally in question and in the core of its existence to interrogate. And so when it was dissolved, Illich became what he called an itinerant scholar for a number of years in universities, mostly at Penn State in the United States and Bremen in Germany, but also with long stays in Ocotepec, which is the town near Cuernavaca where he based his house along with Valentina Borremans. And where a lot of these aspects that appear in Tool for Conviviality and autonomous collective organization are actually being informed by the daily practice of communities in these semi-rural spaces, in this case in Cuernavaca, in Mexico. So one of the reflections that he makes is how symposia has become so stiff and rigid, with people with a lot of pressure to rehearse or to perform their notions of specialty, fields of specialty in the institutions that have allowed their credentials. And he questions how much the schooled mentality and schooled culture that Deschooling Society was questioning is not only through schools themselves, but through introjected and institutionalized imagination, and how it is important to find other ways of gathering that allows to listen to each other, to acknowledge each other's presences in a way that kind of like releases us from these professionalized codings of interaction. And so I found in a very organic process over time that cooking has been an excuse to gather and to get together, but also to produce. Before talking about collective gatherings in a theoretical way or a discursive way, to produce a minimum gesture of collective work that responds to a basic need of the collective, which is nourishing ourselves. And that the capacity of listening to each other and engaging has been through so many other registers of acknowledging each other's presence, recalling embodied memories, our own relationships to cooking, our own origins, embodied knowledges, and other ways in which we kind of take a detour of these very well-learned performance of presenting ourselves by telling our titles and our credentials. Also by setting up kitchens and creating this nourishing act in places where they're not necessarily established. This is Mas Alexandria, that is part of the exhibition, and where we were discussing with the students for a number of weeks how to appropriate the space and make it respond to a more inhabiting and convivial way, not only in terms of pleasure, but also in terms of basic needs, so that the space could be for the students themselves while they were there, and to appropriate that beyond the institutional, or in spite of the institutional budget or management. These are collaborations with different colleagues and educators like Raju Rage, who's also mapped as an educator and artist the undervalued economies of energy that are involved in our practices as cultural workers. And this is a collaboration that happened last year at Framer Framed with Don Juan's Kitchen that Emily was referring to, the mobile kitchen of Don Juan Cam that Emily was referring to yesterday. And so even though it looks only as a convivial and kind of like pleasure way of gathering, it is for me a political exercise of using the tools that are at hand, not only to respond to our own needs and create the conditions to be with and learn together, but also to try to think of the capacity that we have as a collective to create beyond our own needs. So there's this final phrase that I'd like to share that was shared in a recent encounter where I shared about this project that says, cuando nos juntamos 3 personas para cocinar, podemos cocinar para 40. Y cuando nos juntamos 15, podemos cocinar para 200. So when 3 of us get together to cook, we are able to use our collective energy in an exponential way. And I think it's a political exercise of deciding the agency we have in terms of where to orient that capacity of production as a collective. And so inspire beyond being able to cook and to respond to the people who gather initially, that muscle of collective work and practice is actually able to create for an excess for much more than those who gather initially. And so when 3 of us gather to cook, we're able to cook for 40 or more. And this is what I'm kind of like tracing in a practice recently, this reflection that has been originally nourished by coming together with learning threads ideas proposed by Illich. So thank you, and I hope I'm not too over the time in your final day.
Can you hear me? Sophia, do you hear me?
Yes, I do.
Yes. Perfect. Thank you so much. I think your talk was really invigorating, and seeing that Ivan Illich's work is so heavily based in practice also in some ways changes the meaning of his work in relationship to this exhibition. At this point, at this very late hour in the symposium, I would love if there were still a last drop of energy here in our audience. Are there questions?
Sophia, thank you so much. Do you see me? Yeah.
Hi, Nora. Yes.
Hi. Thank you so much for all this. I mean, now I think it's really important to have these insights in the history, and it's far more than I knew and far more than we could discuss here also in Hamburg when we were reading Illich together. My question relates to the fact that the book by Illich that we read already had a later editorial in which he is already pretty angry about how his ideas are taken up in France, not much later. And now we are much later, of course, and we all know that the way how Illich has been, let's say, read is pretty compatible with very problematic capitalizations of education in the West, let's say. And the idea of deschooling society might be really interesting for what I would call an economization of education. That's why Carmen Mersch was always very skeptical about the idea of deschooling society. She always said that this is coming very well together with the deprofessionalization of education, also in the cultural field and so on. Yeah, I just wanted to share with you what we do about that. What is your take on it?
So I think that one of the elements for now, I only focused on the learning threads or the educational web part of the schooling society, but I think one of the most important elements is this need from that particular book to trace these elements of schooling in relation to the hidden curriculum of an economic social project at large. And I think that is the core of deschooling society. So it doesn't mean that it's not easily commodified or abducted, let's say, into a neoliberal side, but I think it is still, for me, when rereading it, a reminder of how that happens today, right? So he's describing all the crucial learnings that are introjected through schooling or through those schooled years, which are differentiated from the content of the curriculum itself, the aspects of spending long hours in confined spaces divided by gender and age under the supervision of a legitimized professional that receive their credentials by the same institution, right? And how this situation of confinement and spending long hours in these conditions is crucial for the working conditions and the labor market, let's say. And this has nothing to do, or it's not directly related to what is being taught and or learned at schools, right? And so I think that relation to the economization of education is there on the one hand. And so I would say it's important to rethink that in the forms of labor and cultural work in particular, where we are today. We're, of course, more flexible elements, and there's also all the economy of experiences and how we relate to that as artists and as cultural workers, and the experiences we produce or propose also in terms of experimentation, right? To me, one of the other elements that is crucial, that still refers to me as an important question from that reflection, is this notion of the institutionalized imagination and how much we reproduce in the context of the art institutions and the cultural institutions, and as agents within that field, how much we reproduce this institutionalized imagination ourselves, even when we are trying to create alternative forms of gathering, no? So I don't have a solution, but I just think that reminding ourselves of these sometimes hidden, and I think much more less hidden and very upfront, let's say, economization of our relationships is more and more present, right? I think tools of conviviality is also directly referring to that, and kind of like betting for a rescaling of the relationships where autonomous decisions within collectives are still possible, and where our production is not inherently embedded in an unlimited growth or an expansive economy, regardless of what we want for our own lives as people, as persons, or as a collective, no? So I don't think it's just because in this particular case we're referring to those references, no? But I think it is a pressing question, and also with the economic conditions that we're living through right now, at least in Latin America, where the effects of the post-pandemic situation are incredibly clear in the basic cost of life, that there seems to be a kind of an overwhelming transactional and economized dynamic taking up all of our time and spaces, right? So definitely, yeah, I don't have the answer or the solution, but I think it's still there. I think it was there back then, and it's still there now. So I guess it also depends on which reading of villages and used by whom in which conditions, is that it becomes a kind of neoliberal only reference.
I wanted to hug and salute our dear Sofía. Hola.
Hola, Nico.
In a very simplistic way, I would say that we were discussing throughout these 2 days very intensively different opportunities, different possibilities to turn around the logics of institutions and questioning how the institution in the educational system can be transforming and can be or cannot be transformed as such, but also like knowing your practices and ongoing relational practices, appunto, and other para-institutional things that are happening all over in the world and almost at the same time. For example, right now in Salento, there is a gathering of people who are thinking exactly about the same. Some of exactly about how to reimagine, rethink the higher education, but also not only from the institutional part, not only having one foot inside of the institution and always the other foot outside, to be critical in the both ways, to be institutional and deinstitutionalize ourselves and to create another forms of economy of exchange and economy of gifts. So these type of collaborations, this type of continuous and contagious gatherings and symposiums are happening everywhere, and many friends like Carmen Jose, who is right now there, she's sending hi, and Alessandra. So like all those kind of symposiums are really happening everywhere, thinking exactly about how to be together and how being together becoming a learning. So it's not necessarily happening within the institutions, but it's important that within the institutions, those things are happening, and within the archives and within the libraries and within the universities, it is as important as in the forest, as in the beach, as in the city. So I really wanted to thank you for your input, and soon we see each other in Mexico. In Cuernavaca. Ciao.
Ciao. Yeah, I guess that there is that, I think also Annette was talking about this in terms of the different notions that she shared of being aware and on learning also, that there is part of the, so it's easier to think of institutions as something that's outside where we're in or out and one for in or out. And then there's also the kind of institutionalized forms of culture that we reproduce within our own practices, whether we are in the forest, in the kitchen, or in the physical spaces where institutions are reproduced. And I think that it's less possible or let's say more urgent, like Nora was saying, to think about the inherent relationship between economies and institutions, and how when we reproduce these practices, we're reproducing both as well.
I just want to add one thing to the discussion. We are all tired, but I think in this question of outside institution, or one step in, one step out, I want to add a term that Oliver Machert brought up last week in a conference on radical democratic education, which is social promiscuity. How are we able for social promiscuity? Because actually the school system, I have to say, is very often more able for social promiscuity than the Kunstverein, for example. And if we want to work on that, I think this term is important. How can we work towards that? Because the self-reproduction is unfortunately very tempting in our self-institutionalization.
Mm-hmm.
Social promiscuity, yeah, it means, the term just means that different people from different parts of society are together. You can, you can also call it contact zone, but I like social promiscuity because we live in a segregated society, as we haven't done since, yeah, it's getting more and more segregated. And in somehow we are part of this segregation. And I think Latin America is also an example for that. And it's, if we want to think about self-organization, I think we have to think it together with social promiscuity, because if we are more bourgeois than the existing institutions, why would we do what we do?
Mm-hmm. And I just wanted to recall that in terms of the spirit of the 8 projects that are part of the educational web, there are a number of spaces and initiatives in Latin America that came to my mind that I was going to talk about, but I didn't because of time. And there is Lugar a Dudas in Cali, Colombia, or Platoedro in Medellín. There's also Más Arte, Más Acción in Bogotá and Chocó. There is also Teorética in Costa Rica. And I mentioned these not as name dropping, but because they are initiatives that were created by artists, most of them, they have that resonance with some of the projects that are part of the exhibition. They were created and feeling a need, actually, that was it's mostly artists who created some kind of prominent career, mostly outside of their home towns, and then kind of like came back and created these spaces that are an in-between space. I love them. I love that they all have a kind of like house scale, 1 or 2 houses. There's always a library, a kitchen, and a kind of open room. And I wouldn't know how to categorize them in this para institution, counter institution or not, but it is context where the official public institutions are so drained and eroded that there are actually very, very few to no conditions to create any archiving, professionalized workspace for cultural practitioners, but it also very, very far from contemporary concerns and younger generations. And so these spaces have become, also Capacete in Rio de Janeiro at the time, they have become a kind of like in-between space that is not exactly an art institution as a center. It's not a museum, it's not emulating those elements, but it is a kind of like in-between space for gathering, where a lot of questioning around accountability and commitment to local processes beyond the art circles are happening as well. So this was not part of my talk, but I think you should look at it.
I think with this remark, we'll let it be the last for these 2 wonderful days. Sofía, thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you. And I hope you get to drink some more and go into the more organic unfolding of exchanges after these 2 days. Thank you so much.
This is also, I think, my cue to say thank you so much for sticking it out. I think we have 1 or 2 last things. Something that came up that was really beautiful in your talk is thinking the web not necessarily in a kind of digital epistemology as maybe is the tendency today, but through the idea of threading, a kind of manual craft, labor intensive over many hours, days, weeks, a whole lifetime. And here I would like to maybe take a moment and honor Ada Abdrusevich's performance here at the back. Maybe should we go have a look also?